A butterfly dreaming it is a man dreaming he is posting on the internet. In recent years, an aesthetic toolbox called Dreamcore emerged on the internet. It is a perceived combination of surreal music, themes, and images of the subconscious, or unconscious. All the histories on this aesthetic have been unsatisfactorily short, perhaps apt for a style that attempts to reflect the submerged unconscious of the internet. All articles ultimately credit it to TikTok kids and claim a largely unknown history prior to 2020. The Aesthetics Wiki, an institution which exists to artificially establish such styles in ad hoc retrospective, described Dreamcore, as of the most recent edit, as, however, it is not intended to give off dread or uneasy feelings. Instead, Dreamcore focuses on emulating the general feeling of a dream and uses bright color. Like other core concepts, Dreamcore exists to establish a sort of implicit affinity between the auditory, visual, and philosophical. Dreamcore is almost purposely incoherent, but ultimately this is an artificial incoherence intended to mimic the uncanny space which exists between dreams and nightmares, the dissonance space. Dreamcore's common features, according to the Aesthetics Wiki, are eyes/teeth/facial features, wings, rainbows, familiar places and people, seeing oneself, bubbles, RPG elements, borders, sparkles, orbs, old CRT televisions as head elements, flowers, mushrooms, and strange creatures. All can be boiled down to elements of anthropomorphism, artistic pastels/natural colors, technological nostalgia, and a sense of the familiar and the fabulous, or vice versa. It is an imitation of the philosophical sublime, or the uncanniness one feels upon the overwhelming threshold of some emotion, often one without name. The music artist Dreamcore claims an affinity for rests between quirky pop and internet music, for lack of a better term. Jack Stauber, Caro Caro Bonito, Crystal Castles, The Caretaker, Windows 96, Beach House, the Minecraft soundtrack, and the Yume Nikki soundtrack. All these run the gamut of themes and emotions, and really games and emotions. Almost all these have a sense of the uncanny to them, or younger people perceive the uncanny in them. It is either the uncanniness of being too bright, too much, or too late. People have deemed Dreamcore an internet aesthetic, but ultimately it is not. The influence of surrealism, strains of mysticism, and the literary uncanny are too obvious in Dreamcore to call it a fully internet aesthetic. All the eeriness of it is projected from the outside. Dreamcore is more or less a latter-day elaboration on fabulism and symbolism, the occurrence of the fabulous, impossible, and strange in the everyday. Dreamcore is fundamentally the product of circular exchanges of influence. Exchanges between cultures, technological developments, and the conscious, subconscious, and unconscious triad. What Dreamcore seeks to strike at is an uncanny, artificial, or sats rendering of dreams through art/music, and, more recently, with the assistance of technology. All the themes it rests upon are centuries old, if not eons old, and even its technological elements are still decades old. It has a deep history before 2020. It is all a dream without beginning or end. The ultimate seed of Dreamcore, and it is ultimately ancient in the minds of men, is a dissonance between the thing and the thing in itself in dreams. The concept has been called the Timaeus or Timaeus dream, depending on one's pronunciation of Greek, after Plato's character of Timaeus from the dialogue Timaeus. Timaeus, the character, is the one who dreams of the elements embodied as Platonic solids, the sublime forms of all shapes that define existence in Plato's philosophical schema of reality. It is these that Timaeus encounters in a frightening dream, when the internal fire of his soul strikes against recent perceptions. This conflict within the body, internal versus external sensations according to Plato, creates a disturbing dissonance on one's perceptions. This concept of the Timaeus Dream was coined on the Dreamview forums in the 2000s, then cataloged on the Agora Road forum in 2020. Both threads delve deep into the newly minted ancient concept in depth. The user PowerGem on the Agora Road noted it as the impossibly large and infinitely small. The concept derives from shared childhood dreams, often fever dreams, where users remember encountering shapes, often both impossibly large and infinitely small at the same time, similar to the Platonic solids Timaeus encounters in the Dialogue of the Timaeus. While Plato uses the idea to support his philosophy of forms, the user's modern minds viewed it through a psychological, physiological lens. There was a sensation about these dreams that causes people to awake in an uncanny horror. All this has often been linked into different traditions of mysticism, but the Timaeus Dream is a highly psychological phenomenon, and it appears again and again throughout art and literature. OP the Cusp on the Dreamview's forum described the classical manifestation of the Timaeus Dream. I have no idea where I am, and am too freaked out to even wonder. I don't think I have a body, because there doesn't seem to be anywhere for my body to be. There is a constant, terrible, overwhelming sound. Or perhaps there's the roar of a deafening silence. Maybe it's a vibration? Whatever the case, it is completely overwhelming. There are shapes, very distinct geometric shapes. 5 of them, I think. They are different colors, but I wouldn't say they were solid, and they were absolutely horrifying. But the worst thing was they moved, or something was moving, agonizingly slow. It was almost like sleep paralysis, only it was slowness. Now it may have been slow, but it was so powerful, so relentless, it seemed to tear at my sanity. Another user, Grexus, then described a similar dream where the self was present, but not the waking self. I once came across a mirror in a void that seemed to reflect my personality or true self. It was like looking at who I am as a whole, very difficult to describe. I was somehow able to see my personality and the nature of who I am. It was distressing to see myself inhuman, yet more at ease. Upon awakening, I nearly vomited. I don't really know how to put the emotional effect of this dream into words, but after some of these dreams, it feels like part of me is missing, almost like I was who I was supposed to be in the dream, and who I am in reality is a hollow disguise of my true self. The Timaeus, or Timaeus Dream, then manifests as an experience of the uncanny and the impossible. Others on the forum agreed with the more abstract qualities enumerated in their own dreams. J. Craig observed, "Almost always these dreams seem to have some time-related theme, as if I, my life, was moving extremely slow, almost to no measurable degree, and that I would be doing this forever. That's a very scary feeling, by the way." One user named Sarah mentioned the sense of size was associated with odd distance in her dreams, such as images like a very thin wire attached to a very thick cable. Unique imagery. Another user, named Burns, said, "I searched for the Platonic solids, but I think mine was a wheel shape? Not a sphere, but a wheel." All these objects posed impossible qualities which conflicted with their very existence. Kakimer described how these nauseating objects manifested in their dreams. Occasionally, in my dreams as a child, I would see a huge sphere that would oscillate between being either completely smooth or completely jagged, i.e. static-like as many seem to mention. It did this in a very nauseating way, and I was overwhelmed by it. There was also this sound or wave that I could both hear and feel, and it vibrated and screeched in an indescribable way as the sphere oscillated. After discussion on the Dreamview's forum, user Only a Speck listed the possible key traits of the Timaeus Dream: paradox, the infinite, synesthesia, disembodiment, dysphoria, repetition, and inevitability. Paradox. The dream itself is physically impossible. Infinite. The dream inhabits or is a never-ending space. Synesthesia. A confusion of the senses often produces nausea in the dream. Disembodiment. The self or body does not exist in these dreams, and one seems to be a free perspective alone, almost like one is no-clipping in a video game. Dysphoria. The sense of self is confused until one awakens. Repetition. The actions of the dreams seem endless in distended time, or almost occur again and again. Inevitability. The dream exists in a state of predestination which generates fear as one is pulled along against their will, if one has a will at all in these dreams. The state of dissonance one awakens to is an attempt to interpret the dream. But paradoxically, despite the terror they inspire in the realm of sleep, these dreams are not nightmares, as there is nothing logical to the terror they inspire. It seems more like a psychological or even physiological response to something. As also quoted on the Dreamview's forum, in his Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Carl Jung also recounted similar anxiety dreams. I had anxiety dreams of things that were now small, now large. For instance, I saw a tiny ball at a great distance. Gradually it approached, growing steadily into a monstrous and suffocating object. Or I saw telegraph wires with birds sitting on them, and the wires grew thicker and thicker, and my fear greater until the terror awoke me. One night during an attack, I stood at the foot of the bed. Above me I saw a glowing blue circle about the size of the full moon, and inside it moved golden figures which I thought were angels. This vision was repeated, and each time it allayed my fear. These dreams of the impossible have existed throughout history, and ultimately, certain themes seem to repeat through them: spheres, wires, and angels. One perhaps should also mention Carl Jung's own interest in the infinite symbolism of mandalas, and his theories of UFOs as psychological projections, but that's beside the point. Still, they're interesting points to keep on the other side of the mind. Argentine author Jorge Luis Borges dedicated a brief essay to these animals in the form of spheres. Borges, so fascinated with dreams due to his blindness, often contemplated Plato's obsession with these uncreated, always spheres. The Earth's spherical form is akin to that of the noblest organ, the eye. The blind Borges then quoted the German psychologist Gustav Theodor Fechner in that, if the sky is really the home of angels, these angels are obviously stars, for the sky has no other inhabitants. Again, in 1977, Borges crossed into the examination of the Timaeus dream in his lecture La Pesadilla, or in English, The Nightmare. As Borges stated in La Pesadilla, siempre sueño con laberintos o con espejos. Always do I dream of labyrinths and of mirrors. In the lecture, Borges quotes Samuel Taylor Coleridge's theory of dreams, truncated here. It is the dream that searches for explanations. The emotions of the mind are expressed in the dream images. To illustrate this, Borges uses a dream of a sphinx. The sphinx is an impossible creature. It does not exist in reality, and can only be given a body in fantasy or in dreams. When one awakens to the idea or image of a sphinx, one was dreaming of all the things the monstrous sphinx represents. In Coleridge's theory, which heavily borrowed from Plato's, the sphinx is not the dream itself, but an explanation for the terror felt by the mind during sleep. The emotions and sensations come before the imagery. Upon awakening, the human mind conjures the images to explain what it felt under the pale of sleep. That is why such images dissolve so easily. La esfinge no es la causa del terror, es una explicación de la presión sentida. The Sphinx is not the cause of the terror, it is an explanation for the oppression felt. Note here, not fear, but oppression. Is the dream true or false? Borges argues it ultimately matters very little. Borges points to William Wordsworth's poetic interlude, often called The Dream of the Arab, found in the 5th book of his magnum opus, The Prelude, originally titled as The Poem to Coleridge, from pages 109 to 113. Borges often praised Wordsworth's vividness, suggesting the clarity of immortal dreams to him, and Wordsworth himself was said to often suffer waking premonitions of doom. The Dream of the Arab recounts a supposed dream the poet had in his youth after reading a book by the sea, one on poetry and geometric truth, though it may have also just been Don Quixote. Borges upholds this dream interlude, real or invented, as having all the elements of the nightmare: physical discomfort, a sense of persecution, an element of horror, and the sense of the supernatural. In it, Wordsworth, or the narrator, essentially one and the same for the prelude, awakens into the dream of an uncanny desert of black sand and void. Sleep seized me and I passed into a dream. I saw before me stretched a boundless plain of sandy wilderness all black and void, and as I looked around, distress and fear came creeping over me when at my side... As he awakens, an Arab, upon a camel, approaches Wordsworth. As this is a dream, though, the Arab is also Cervantes' Don Quixote. The figure is both the Bedouin nomad and the deluded knight. As Wordsworth describes the interloper, he, to my fancy, had become the knight, whose tale Cervantes tells, yet not the knight, but was an Arab of the desert too. Of these was neither, and was both at once. His countenance, meanwhile, grew more disturbed. The figure is more a representation than he is an actual thing or persona. The Arab Quixote rests a spear under his arm, but he holds two objects, a stone and, in the opposite hand, a shell/conch of surpassing brightness. The Arab Quixote tells Wordsworth that the stone is also the philosopher Euclid's Elements. When Wordsworth brings the conch to his ear, he hears an overwhelming loudness, what he thinks to be the voice of God, but is actually all the poetry of the entire world. It is the Arab Quixote's mission to preserve these two objects against an apocalyptic doom. The Semi-Quixote's stone, then, is the entirety of science, and his shell is all the written inheritance of humanity. These objects are not innate in themselves, but instead the things they represent. The Semi-Quixote must bury them, as he tells Wordsworth, because a great doom is upon them and their glory. There comes after, across the black desert, a shining wave, and looking backwards when he looked to mine eyes, saw over half the wilderness diffused, a bed of glittering light. I asked the cause. It is, said he, the waters of the deep, gathering upon us. Quickening then the pace of the unwieldy creature he bestrode, he left me. I called after him aloud. He heeded not, but, with his twofold charge still in his grasp, before me, full in view, went hurrying over the illimitable waste, with the fleet waters of a drowning world, in chase of him, whereat I awaked in terror, and saw the sea before me, and the book, in which I had been reading at my side. As terror shakes him, Wordsworth then awakens to nature where all is as it appears. Is it representative? Wordsworth's phantom Semi-Quixote, as he calls the figure, represents the unconsciousness to us today, but to Wordsworth, it was something more sublime. The dream of the Arab exemplifies almost all the categories associated with the Timaeus dream. Paradox. The Semi-Quixote's stone and shell are actually Euclid's Elements, geometric science, and the shell is poetry and word itself. The infinite. The dream occurs in an infinite black desert of void, illimitable waste which is inundated by a blinding tsunami. Synesthesia. Both the shell and the waters of the deep exhibit brightness which confuse the senses. Disembodiment. Wordsworth sounds to pass into the dream as vision and little more. Dysphoria. While not to Wordsworth himself, or his dream self, the Semi-Quixote shifts beneath Wordsworth's vision and does not have a stable identity. Inevitability. And as I looked around, distress and fear came creeping over me, and with the fleet waters of a drowning world. Borges, in his lecture, points out this was long before the advent of the atomic bomb. There seems to be a sense of terror or uncanny terror innate in these sorts of dreams, though Borges lacked a clear category to term them outside simply nightmares. Wordsworth was not the only writer to suffer these dreams of overwhelming, uncanny doom. J.R.R. Tolkien often wrote about his similar nightmares, or Atlantis haunting, of an ineluctable wave that overturned civilizations and sunk continents in his dreams. He compared it to the Great Wave which was said to have destroyed Plato's Atlantis. Interestingly enough, Tolkien's son Michael said he suffered the exact same dream complex, and often conversed about it with his father. In more abstract conceptual terms, writer Vladimir Nabokov said his dreams in childhood were haunted by enormous spheres and an endless series of numbers which root was always 212. Nabokov's later conundrum short story, Symbols and Signs, or Signs and Symbols, would make use of a similar sort of intertextual persecution complex he coined as referential mania, otherwise known as delusions of reference. Borges himself suffered uncanny nightmares of infinite rooms, familiar spaces, and labyrinths since his childhood. Spheres often appeared in his dreams as the most disorienting shapes, but, as Borges admitted, the sphere is the most uniform and perfect shape. The geometric nature of dreams seems inherent to the dissonance felt within them. A word needs to be found. I can only think of transmission, interpretation, but even they are not quite right to describe what happens when my reading flows into my arrangement of black and white, said the French artist Orlan Redon. The painter-illustrator wrote, in a letter to his friend in 1989, he hated the blank page so much he almost feared its unbroken totality. Redon's charcoals and pastels nearly universally prefigure the aesthetics of what would, on the internet, be termed Dreamcore. Redon had a fascination with symbols that appeared in his own dreams. Strange fantastical or mythological creatures, disembodied heads, floating eyes, and the disorientation or manipulation of space and perspective. Those dreams fed by Baudrillard's literary works, Flaubert's novel, The Temptation of St. Anthony, and Japanese woodprints, mainly hokusai, which inspired his style. Eyes, the most noble organ, and concrete shapes often appear in tandem in Rodin's more gothic charcoal works. The Cube, 1880, features a single cube with a single eye, floating in an astral ethereum. Is this space or dream space? Rodin once said, on astronomer Camille Flammarion, the breath that drives the beings is also in the heavenly spheres. The cube is not alone in this work, though. Below it there is a bust of an unevolved humanoid. Dreams, mysticism, and science often merged in the sealed realities depicted in Rodin's paintings. Then Rodin's The Eye, like a strange balloon mounts towards infinity, 1882, dedicated to Edgar Allan Poe, features a head on a saucer, a literal flying saucer, suspended from a balloon that's actually a massive eye. The eye looks upwards towards its true shape reflected in the heavenly spheres. Another one of Borges, or actually Plato's, Animals in the Form of Spheres. Rodin's Man-Carrying Dice and The Gambler both feature figures, but they are figures placed under the burden of oversized dice. Dice appear in several of Rodin's works as geometrical cubes given utility. These shapes and eyes have a significance alien to waking reality, but felt by the slumbering spirit. Heads, too, inspired by the severed head of John the Baptist in art, filled Rodin's own head. Severed Head, 1878, displays a disembodied head haunted by other, smaller, cherubic heads with wings. It is more concrete, but still the thing of dreams or religious ecstasy. Heads, for Rodin, seem to be eyes evolved into concrete maturity, sperm to fetus. The vague glimmer of a head suspended in space, 1891, is even more abstract and seems to evoke the endless landscape of a dreamscape, filled only by an infinitely small and impossibly large object. A suspended face in a frame here. Rodin's Head of Christ, 1890s, and The Buddha, 1895, are equally evocative, though they have bodies attached to their heads. Rodin's Christ is a near featureless figure, marked only by the shadows and the crown of thorns. Then Rodin's Buddha is accompanied by a perfect reflective sphere, representative of nirvana as much as Christ's featurelessness is representative of his universality. Rodin's dream figures are too multitudinous and too wonderful to count in truth. This is not to neglect Rodin's paintings and pastels, which are just as fantastical. Rodin's color works are less alien than his early charcoals, but they are attempts to depict the impossible colors and travails of dreams. The Winged Man, the Fallen Angel, shows Rodin's manipulations of light and subject. The Fallen Angel is inherently dark against the light, likely that of heaven, that shines on it. While the light here is not technically impossible, the sharp contrast is a clear attempt to mimic those strange colors seen only in dreams. The Winged Man walks across the clouds, with a gait akin to primitive man's, towards a goal unknown to the viewer, perhaps a fallen or saved world. Rodin then returned to the theme of the Buddha in 1904 with his canvas work, Buddha. No longer is the Buddha distinct in this image, but sat in the lotus position, he almost blends in with the Bodhi tree in the background and the bloom of flowers that surrounds him, almost a cavalcade. One should note the flowers in this image are not naturalist flowers, but a sort of parade of vague shapes and colors, bulbous and almost awkward. The bloom of flowers is reminiscent of the spermazoid eyes and spheres, though they themselves are still unevolved into their fullness. It is interesting then that Rodin's flower paintings and pastels were popular among Japanese collectors in the 1970s and 1980s. There were Rodin shows at Kamakura's Museum of Modern Art in 1973 and the Tokyo Museum of Modern Arts in 1989. Rodin's work, fed by Eastern influence and Japanese prints, flowed back into Japan. Those displays, and that popularity during the 1970s-1980s, may have gone on to inspire Japanese artists and designers, who, decades later, would again inspire other artists. The cycle of influence turning. Who knows, that JRPG creature may just be a grandson of Odilon Rodin's dream creatures, finally evolved into their ripeness. Or it's just a slime. Mustaches, anteaters, and Hitler masturbating 1973, the ways Dali prefigure the internet. The Sick Child in 1921 is a self-portrait by young Salvador Dali, painted under the throes of an illness in Spain. The surreal portrait is a subtle yet enlightening example on the depiction of dreams, the distortion of one's identity in the boy's featureless yet smug face, similar to the empty face of Rodin's Christ. The image is almost flat, but space is implied in the boy, table, bird controlling the foreground, and the boats upon the sea in the background. Dali's manipulation and compression of space. Once again, the sea appears associated with a sense of flat distortion. There is not any obvious sense of time in this image, as one cares little for time while dreaming, but there is a sort of shine to the boy's face, the boats, and the caged bird. The colors here are those people usually recount seeing in fever dreams: toxic yellows, muddy browns, harsh silvers, false blacks, and odd blues. If it is not obvious yet, all this uncanniness, which Dali so enjoyed, could be considered elements of a Timaeus dream. The direct horror emerges in the boy's hand. Upon the blanket, the fingers are distended and it resembles more a mutated claw. This is a self-portrait, but it is a self-portrait of the dream self. As Dali wrote, oddly straightforward for him, in the Mystical Manifesto, all these subjects, however incredible they seem to you, once you will have seen them, you will be able to paint them realistically. It is no surprise Salvador Dali was swayed by the mysticism of dreams and a reality below reality. Dali's Crucifixion, Corpus Hypercubus, 1954, a decades-long project, sought to unite his own sense of religion, science, and art in one, a style that has been called nuclear mysticism. Christ crucified to a cross composed of multi-dimensional tesseract hypercubes, a Dali net. Dali attempting to transcend the human element of Christ beyond the Platonic realm in painting. This painting has been called surrealist, but it is beyond that. Dali's wife, Gala Dali, appears as Mary Magdalene, the representation of 3D humanity before this hyperdimensional passion. Dali described his path to create a fusion of ecstatic dissonance. In the surrealist period, I wanted to create the iconography of the interior world, the world of the marvelous, of my father Sigmund Freud. I succeeded in doing it. Today, the exterior world, that of physics, has transcended the one of psychology. My father today is Dr. Heisenberg. A state of pure mysticism through the fusion of religion and physics in the 4D hypercube or Dali cross. The sublime harmony of such principles exists to bring about the blooming of ecstasy. Dali called this principle, to himself and to his public, anarchic monarchy, one of Dali's many, on the surface, self-defeating anti-concepts invented to convey a deeper point like a Zen koan. Anarchic monarchy, this is the almost divine harmony of opposites proclaimed by Heraclitus. Here he credits the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Heraclitus with the origin of the concept. The thinker Heraclitus, who believed all things are in constant flux, often noted as the godfather of alternate traditions of classical derived thought, separate from those of Socrates and Plato, most famously Nietzsche's concept of the eternal recurrence. One fragment attributed to Heraclitus on dreams states this: "The waking have one common world, but the sleeping turn aside each into a world of his own." The private world of dreams is where the unity of absolute opposites is possible. Dreamcore, as one of its defining traits, seems acutely interested in that interior private world, often conceived as some impossible urban or suburban environment. In American manifestations, and a majority of the internet is ultimately America, this seems to be an inheritance from artists such as the Californian Kenton Nelson. Nelson himself was inspired by 1940s public art installations funded by the Federal Works Progress Administration, WPA, artist Edward Hopper's crisp paintings of singular ennui and isolation in the American landscape, and the Jazz Age writer F. Scott Fitzgerald's fiction. Nelson's prints then are so idealized to almost seem unreal. One can see a kinship with surrealist René Magritte's paintings. Their almost plastic nature, peoples and houses, crosses over into the sublime. Nelson calls his artistic ideal narrative idealism. The concept and images implied stories should completely remove one from their space and time, absorbing them completely into the painting. Nelson's characters/figures are always covered in a sense of nouveau-rich anonymity. His urban environments are often empty or inhabited only by a single token dreamer, who, often, barely stands out in the scene, or is the scene alone. In these paintings, light and shapes are almost artificial, more like a plastic set model than a scene. Images that are the Platonic ideal of a New Yorker cover, and Nelson has appeared on the New Yorker several times. That might be why his images are sort of in the public consciousness, just in the background. Bathed in light is the phrase that has been used to describe the picture-perfect idealism of Nelson's work in their static style. Nelson, though, ascribes his style to old photographs. Mainly, he credits old family photographs where one person's face is accidentally cropped out of frame. This contributed to the anonymous everyman characters that appear in his paintings. Nelson's melancholic, occasionally anachronistic images display a form of tech nostalgia, technology nostalgia, a newer form of technology, photography, shaping the form of an older art medium, painting. Nelson's paintings then have an unreal dream nostalgia to them because they're meant to evoke that past. What do dreams sound like then? To that there is no agreement, but Eno might have an idea. Jack Stauber, Caro Bonito, Crystal Castles, The Caretaker, Windows 96, Beach House, the Minecraft soundtrack, and the Yume Nikki soundtrack. What is their shared kinship? ultimately a sort of shared descent or ancestry. Brian Eno is ultimately the godfather of them all, though Eno himself often openly admits a large influence from French composer Eric Satie. Eno's ambient music and oblique pop music has touched every possible branch of music and beyond. He even worked on the generative music soundtrack for Will Wright's Spore. Eno's 1970s work solidified ambient music as a genre in itself, which would go on to influence many branches of ambient, then later environmental and background music. Here's how Eno originally described ambient music in 1978 on his Ambient 1, Music for Airports. Ambient music must be able to accommodate many levels of listening attention without enforcing one in particular. It must be as ignorable as it is interesting. Eno, unused full name here, obtusely interested in recording technology, is to the father, or one at fault, for quirky internet music ultimately. Eno's minimalist works, Another Green World in 1975, and Before and After Science, 1977, featuring musicians from Phil Collins to Robert Fripp of King Crimson, developed a unique sound out of the alien structure of sound itself, rather than, as far as Eno was concerned, as music. One unique Eno trait is developing lyrics as a sort of aesthetic sound poetry, rather than as semantic lyrics. As the BBC described Eno, he succeeded because he knew nothing about how to make pop records, and he failed because he knew nothing about how to make pop records. Another Green World, 1975, ventures between minimalistic pop rock and outright ambient or environmental music. The album is perhaps best known for its strange, improvised instruments, which Eno dubbed with quirky, sui generis titles as if pulling them out of the ether. On the track St. Elmo's Fire, Robert Fripp plays a Wimshurst guitar, named after a late 1800s circular electric generator, due to how quickly Fripp played or generated the guitar on the track. On the eponymous Another Green World, Eno, alone, contributes the piano, the descriptively named Desert guitars, and the very real, though obscure, Farfisa organ. Little Fishes credits a prepared piano to Eno, and on the next track, Golden Hours, Fripp plays the very demonymically named Wimborne guitar. Golden Hours deserves credit for having an internet sound, dial-up-esque before the internet was at all commonplace, and is reflective of humanity's own relationship with time and technology. The album is much more concerned with the subconscious environment. It is all very twee in a mirthful, dreamlike sense. But, as it is Brian Eno, there's definitely something much, much larger going on beneath the surface. This music, Eno admits, was innovative by how purposefully artificial its sound was. Working from the realization that my music was less and less connected with performability, but was created in and of the studio, I took advantage of the fact that music produced in recording studios, rather than music reproduced by studios, has the option of creating its own psychoacoustic space. Psychoacoustic space, as in a private world for the music in itself. Eno has occasionally called 1978's Before and After Science ocean music in contrast to Another Green World's sky music. Before and After Science is much more concerned with the unconscious environment rather than subconscious. As shown earlier, the unconscious so often takes the shape of a sea or even a wave. The title seems to reflect something unspoken about the human mind, but the album is too heterogeneous to tell what exactly. The album, supposedly, saw 120 tracks produced for the 10 songs that were eventually featured on the album. Once again, Eno's oddly intangible lyrical constructions return, but especially in No One Receiving, they remain purposefully obtuse. BBC credited this to Eno's forward thinking on his albums. Both sounded like pop music, but made by someone who had only been on the planet for a week. They were actually the sound of the future. Eno's bon mots surface best, and the pun is on purpose, in the second track, Backwater. The song is highly aquatic, but it almost borders on Dadaistic sound poetry. The lyrics tell the story in quotation marks here, of 6 lost sailors, soon turned to 5, sailing at the edges of time. But the words turn into an endless tangent which passes from idea to character like a baton. The tangent exists more for the utility of its acoustic quality of endless flowing rhyme, rather than for the story. The song is essentially an endless run-on sentence filled with purposefully bizarre verbal constructions, i.e., not a sausage to do. Compare Backwater then to the album's closing track, Spider and I. Both are heavily aquatic themed and have to do with sailing. Spider and I is a very heartfelt droning tune about spiders and ships, or a reflection on sonic existence itself. Spiders technically cannot hear music since their perception is so vastly different from humans, but that gets into the more complex themes and I'm not a biologist. Aquatic themes and the familiarity of sleep bubble up in this song. We sleep in the mornings. We dream of a ship that sails away, 1,000 miles away. This is Eno breaching the pale of consciousness into levels of dreams and dissonance and memory. There is an emergent emotional paradox in these alien depths. Frequent Eno collaborator John Hassel has described this sound as fourth world music, a purposefully out there term. Hassel sees it as a unified primitive/futuristic sound combining features of world ethnic styles with advanced electronic techniques. It's a world beyond this one, a literal fourth dimension of sound. Fourth world music finds a companion in the equally obtuse designation of imaginary folklore. Both musical terms employed to escape from the overwhelming abyss of the New Age category and envision something beyond this world and this reality. Composer Simon Jeffs employed the term to describe his own project, the Penguin Cafe Orchestra. Though never as well known as Eno's work, the Penguin Cafe Orchestra was signed to Eno's label, and had Eno as an executive producer under Editions EG, or EG Records. The origins of Jeff's orchestra, though, are intimately connected to dreams. Inspired by African music he heard in Japan, then, while sojourning in the south of France, Jeffs had a dream, due to food poisoning, of a place wherein everybody was taken up with self-interested activity, which kept them looped in on themselves. It wasn't like they were prisoners, they were all active, but only within themselves. Stories vary as if to the place in Jeff's dream was an empty residential block, or the cafe itself, but perhaps, as dreams are, it was both in one. A day after this, in either the waking world or a dream of the waking world, Jeffs heard a voice tell him, "I am the proprietor of the Penguin Cafe. I will tell you things at random." In Jeff's ideal, inspired by this phrase from nowhere, this fantasy cafe existed beyond the bonds and borders of reality. The cafe's specials were the rewritten laws of physics and music. Jeffs desired to create a new music for this cafe, so became the Penguin Cafe Orchestra, or where unconsciousness can just be. Penguin Cafe Orchestra's sound then escapes the atmosphere of genre into the space of sui generis. The players changed over the years, but fundamentally, as Jeffs was a classical-turned-experimental musician, the Penguin Cafe Orchestra's bright sound can only be called classical avant-garde. The band has always been heavily reliant on strings, using multiple cellos on each song, but put those strings to use towards definitively unclassical-like harmonies. The orchestra has been said to have elements of avant-pop, classical art music, art rock, chamber music, pastoral music, hillbilly ambient, minimalist hot jazz, yodel, electronic with influences from Jeff's native England, the United States, Japan, and African cultures. The multitude of instruments involved in the orchestra only made the sound more universal. Jeff's harmonium, the inspiration for Music for a Found Harmonium, a song composed before the Penguin Cafe Orchestra existed. The harmonium he found one day wandering around the back alleys of Kyoto in Japan. Jeffs left a note on the junk harmonium, saying he would take it in one day if nobody reclaimed it. Returning the next day, Jeffs found the note unmoved, and took the harmonium with him around the world. Then the song Telephone and Rubber Band samples dial tones from a phone, adding even more complications to the Penguin Cafe Orchestra's exact genre. If it can even be said to have an exact genre. Penguin music? Jeffs coined the genre imaginary folklore to describe the orchestra's intentions. It was music for a place that did not exist and could not exist. The song titles off 1981's self-titled Penguin Cafe Orchestra are all very twee, but all evocative of a sublime idea that exists only in the cafe. Yodel 1, Telephone and Rubber Band, Pythagoras' Trousers, Salty Bean Fumble, The Ecstasy of Dancing Fleas, and Harmonic Necklace. There is an unspoken total art or unity between all the floating elements. The album covers were uncanny paintings by artist, now famous sculptor, Emily Young, which featured emperor penguins and humanoids with the heads of penguins, akin to statues of Egyptian gods, in colorful pastoral or bright plein air scenes. These humanoids always have some musical element associated with them, instruments, dancing, or dreamlike sonic abstractions of music. These two factions, penguins and imposter penguins, never seem to get along on the covers, but they do share a unity in the music of the cafe. The title of each song is always expressed in the music in an abstract manner. Cutting branches for a temporary shelter, Penguin Cafe Orchestra has many interesting titles like that one, tings and whines with the trials and travails of survival on some distant place. The song is slow with organic sounds of jungle or forests spaced out in the ecological background. It's ambient music, the ambience of survival. The group's most famous song, though, is probably Perpetuum Mobile. It's exactly what it says, a moving series of continuous notes. It's an actual phrase, too. The song invokes motion and progress through piano keys and strings. It is as if the music is accelerating towards the vanishing point of sound. Other song titles are more dreamlike and specific in the obtuse emotions they play on, such as the sound of someone you love who's going away and it doesn't matter. While this sensation could be felt in waking life, it is a sentiment that is, more often than not, felt only in the bizarrely exact scenarios of sleep. It is no surprise then Simon Jeffs composed a ballet based on the orchestra, Still Life at the Penguin Cafe, narrated by Jeremy Irons of all people, which debuted in 1988. Since it is a ballet, the plot is sparse, but it is set in Jeffs' Penguin Cafe, wherever that might be. Though Simon Jeffs passed away in 1997, the Penguin Cafe Orchestra has continued on through his son, Arthur Jeffs, who leads a successor band called Penguin Cafe. As Jeff's son, Arthur described his father's musical consciousness, "My understanding of my father's music is that it often became its own subject. He would pinpoint an idea, say one arising from a mathematical progression. Pythagoras was very important to him, and then he would zoom in on it and its consequences. The familiar in the fabulous, or the fabulous in the familiar. Let this serve as a longer history of dreams then, leading up to Dreamcore. To end the backwards, forwards, backwards progression of dream logic then, the world of this video will then end with Jorge Luis Borges' own transcribed dream, Ragnarok. The fact that the entire dream consisted of a single scene will erase or ease this fundamental difficulty. It took place in the Humanities Building, at dusk. As often happens in dreams, everything was somehow different. Everything had been affected by a slight enlargement. We were electing people to committees. I was chatting with Pedro Enriquez Rina, who in reality had been dead for many years. Suddenly, we were assaulted by the racket of a street band or demonstration. The cries of people and animals reached us from the lower city. A voice cried, "Here they come." Then, "It's the gods." 4 or 5 individuals emerged from the mob and took their place on the stage of the lecture hall. We all cheered, weeping. It was the gods, coming back after centuries of exile. The stage made them taller. They threw their heads back and thrust their chests forward in haughty acceptance of our homage. One of them was holding a bow of the kind no doubt required by the simplistic botany of dreams. Another made a broad gesture with his hand, which was a claw. One of Janus's faces looked apprehensively at the curving beak of Thoth. Stirred perhaps by our cheers, another one, I'm no longer sure which one, broke out in triumphant but incredibly harsh clacking, complete with gargles and whistles. From that point on, things began to change. It was all due to our perhaps precipitous suspicion that the gods did not know how to talk. Hundreds of years of living like animals on the run had atrophied their human dimension. The moon of Islam and the Roman cross had been merciless with these fugitives. The decadence of the Olympic bloodline was evident in their beetling brows, yellowed teeth, patchy half-breed or Chinese whiskers, and bestial protruding lips. Their clothing spoke not of genteel poverty, but of the flashy bad taste of the lower city's backrooms and bordellos. A carnation bled from one buttonhole. We detected the outline of a dagger under a tight-fitting jacket. All at once we sensed that they were playing their last card, and they had grown sly, stultified and cruel like aging beasts of prey, and they would destroy us if we allowed ourselves to be swayed by fear or pity. We drew our heavy pistols. In the dream, they just appeared, and cheerfully put the gods to death. Jorge Luis Borges, Ragnarok. Translated by Kenneth Krabenhoft. I'd like to give a sleepy thank you to my supporter, the Gel Samini family.